At 11 o'clock on the night of September 25, 1968, four musicians walked into Olympic Studios in Barnes, southwest London, and started recording. They had been a band for 36 days. They had 15 hours of rehearsal between them. They had no record deal, no advance, no label support, and no guarantee that anyone would ever release what they were about to make. The only money in the room was coming out of Jimmy Page's personal bank account. 30 hours later, they walked out with Led Zeppelin, not a demo, not a rough cut, a finished, mixed, sequenced album that would reach the top 10 on both sides of the Atlantic within weeks of its release, launch the most successful rock career of the 1970s, and become the foundational document of an entire genre of music that is still being made and sold and listened to 56 years later. If you're new here, this channel tells the real stories behind Led Zeppelin that nobody talked about. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The real cost of making that album was £1,782. What that £1,782 bought, and how Jimmy Page structured the transaction so that the return on that investment would be unlike anything the music industry had seen before, is the part of the story that most accounts of the first album do not tell completely. This is that part. To understand what happened at Olympic Studios in September and October of 1968, you need to understand the specific situation that Jimmy Page was in during the summer of that year, and the calculation he was making about how to exit it. Page had joined the Yardbirds in 1966 as a bassist, then moved to lead guitar alongside Jeff Beck, then became the band's sole lead guitarist when Beck departed for his own project. The Yardbirds in 1966 and 1967 were still a significant commercial concern, particularly in America, where their blues-derived hard rock had found an audience that the British charts had never fully delivered. But the band was fragmenting. Keith Relf and Jim McCarty, the vocalist and drummer who had been central to the Yardbirds' identity since its beginning, wanted to move in a more acoustic, folk-influenced direction. Page wanted to move somewhere considerably heavier and more ambitious. By the spring of 1968, the creative disagreement had become irreconcilable. Relf and McCarty left to form a band called Renaissance. Bassist Chris Draja left to become a photographer. The Yardbirds, in any meaningful sense, were over. What Page had left was a legal entity, the Yardbirds' name, and a set of Scandinavian tour dates that had already been booked and paid for. The promoters expected the Yardbirds, Page, who had given up a lucrative session musician career, to join the band, and who was not interested in returning to session work, needed to fulfill those dates while simultaneously building the new band he had been conceptualizing. The Scandinavian tour was not an obstacle, it was an opportunity. It gave him a deadline. He moved quickly. He had already identified Robert Plant through Terry Reid's recommendation, and had watched Plant perform at a teacher training college in Birmingham in late July. He had gone to see John Henry Bonham play with Tim Rose at a club in North London on July 31st, watched Bonham play a 5-minute drum solo, and understood immediately that he had found his drummer. John Paul Jones, who had been one of the most sought-after session musicians and arrangers in London for the previous 5 years, having arranged and played on records for artists ranging from Donovan to the Rolling Stones, had heard about the new project through his own contacts and telephoned Page directly to ask if there was a place for him. Page said yes. The four men assembled for their first rehearsal at a studio in Lisle Street, Soho, London, on August 19, 1968. It was the day before Robert Plant's 20th birthday. Plant was the youngest person in the room. Page was 24. John Paul Jones was 22. John Henry Bonham was 20. What happened in that room on August 19th has been described by everyone who was present in terms that converge on the same experience. Regardless of how many years had passed when they described it, they played together for the first time, running through material that Page had been preparing. The riff to what would become Communication Breakdown, the structure of what would become I Can't Quit You Baby, fragments of what would become How Many More Times, and something happened in that room that none of them had fully anticipated. Page described it as the room exploding. Plant, recalling it decades later, said, Just instant, this is fantastic, and just like, whoa. Jones, who was not a man given to hyperbole, and who had played on hundreds of recording sessions with dozens of significant artists, simply that he had sensed something good was happening and had not been wrong. The rehearsal lasted approximately 3 hours. At the end of it, they were a band. 15 days later, on September 4th, they flew to Scandinavia under the name the New Yardbirds and began the tour that Page had inherited from the dissolving Yardbirds. They played 9 shows across Denmark and Sweden over the following 2 weeks, performing a set that was split between Yardbirds material and the new songs they had worked out in the single rehearsal at Lyle Street. The shows were not large by the standards of what was coming. They were club and theater dates, audiences of a few hundred to a few thousand. But they served the purpose Page intended. 4 musicians played together every night for 2 weeks, found what worked and what didn't, adjusted the arrangements in real time, based on how audiences responded, and arrived back in London with a live set that was cohesive and battle-tested. By the time they re-entered London, Page had already decided something that would define Led Zeppelin's relationship with the music industry for the entire 12 years of the band's existence. He was not going to approach a record label before the album was made. He was going to make the album first, using his own money, retaining complete creative and commercial control over every decision involved in the process. Then, when the album was finished, he would walk into a label's office with a finished product and negotiate from a position of strength rather than supplication. This was not how things were done in 1968. In 1968, artists went to labels. Labels provided money and studio time. Labels retained ownership of the master recordings. Labels decided what songs would be on the album. Labels decided the sequencing, the artwork, the release date, and often the arrangements. The artist's role in this transaction was primarily to deliver material and perform when required. Artistic control was not a phrase that appeared in most recording contracts because the question of who controlled the art was not considered particularly open. Page understood this and had no intention of accepting it. He had spent 6 years as a session musician watching producers and A&R men make decisions about recordings that he considered technically and artistically inferior to the decisions he would have made himself. He had his own vision of what Led Zeppelin should sound like, and he was not going to share that vision with anyone who had the contractual power to override it. So he called Peter Grant. Grant was Led Zeppelin's manager, a former professional wrestler who had moved into music management in the early 1960s and who had developed a reputation for a combination of intimidation and genuine strategic intelligence that made him uniquely effective at extracting Vince from promoters and labels who would not have yielded to a more conventionally diplomatic approach. Grant understood immediately what Page was proposing and agreed immediately to co-finance the sessions. Between them, they committed to paying for studio time, engineering costs, and production costs out of their own pockets, with no external financial involvement and no obligation to deliver the result to anyone until they chose to. They booked time at Olympic Studios in Barnes. Olympic Studios in 1968 was one of the most technically advanced recording facilities in London, which meant it was one of the most technically advanced recording facilities in the world. The Rolling Stones had recorded there. Jimi Hendrix had recorded there. The studio had a particular quality of sound, related to the size of its live room and the characteristics of its desk and outboard equipment, that Page knew from his session musician days. He knew what Olympic could do, and he knew how to use it. He also knew exactly what he wanted the album to sound like before a single note was recorded. This is the detail that explains how 30 hours of studio time produced a finished album of this quality. Page arrived at Olympic Studios not with ideas, but with a complete sonic vision. He had been working on arrangements for the material during the Scandinavian tour, refining them in real time in front of audiences. He knew precisely what microphone placement he wanted on John Henry Bonham's drum kit. He knew the guitar tones he was going to use on each song. He had a production philosophy, which centered on capturing the live sound of the band playing together in a room, with minimal overdubbing. Rather than the layered studio construction that had been the dominant approach since Sgt. Pepper, that he had been developing for years as a session musician, watching other producers work and understanding what he disagreed with in their methods. The engineer for the sessions was Glyn Johns, who had worked with the Rolling Stones and who had precisely the technical skills and temperament that Page needed. Johns was not the kind of engineer who pushed his own aesthetic onto a recording. He was a facilitator, someone who understood how to capture what a musician or producer was hearing in their head and translate it into what came out of the speakers. Page and Johns had a working relationship from Page's session days. The communication between them during the Olympic sessions was efficient, in the way that communication between people who speak a common technical language is efficient. They did not waste time. The band entered the studio at 11 o'clock on the night of September 25th and began recording. They worked through the night. The material they were recording was material they had been playing live for 2 weeks on the Scandinavian tour, which meant it was not new to any of them. The arrangements were fixed. The tempos were settled. What needed to happen in the studio was capture, getting the performances onto tape with the sound that Page had in his head. Robert Plant's vocals were recorded almost entirely in single takes. Page would later explain that Plant's ability to deliver a complete, emotionally committed vocal performance on the first or second attempt was one of the things that made the recording process as fast as it was. There was no laboring over vocal takes, no accumulation of 30 or 40 performances to be edited together. Plant walked to the microphone, sang the song, and what you heard on the record was essentially that. John Henry Bonham's drums presented a different kind of problem, which was not a performance problem but a capture problem. Bonham's physical approach to the instrument was fundamentally different from the way drums were typically mic'd in 1968. The standard approach was close miking, placing microphones as near to each drum surface as possible to capture a clean, isolated signal. Page did not want a clean, isolated signal. He wanted the sound of Bonham playing in a room. He wanted the air around the drums, the way the sound spread through the studio space, the natural ambience that happened when a man of Bonham's physical capability hit a Ludwig kit at the volume Bonham habitually played. He and Johns experimented with microphone placement during the early sessions and found configurations that captured what Page was hearing. The drum sound on the first Led Zeppelin album is a room sound, not a close-mic'd sound, and that distinction is audible. To anyone who listens to Good Times, Bad Times through a good speaker system and tries to understand why the drums sound the way they do. Good Times, Bad Times opened the album and contained, in its first 30 seconds, something that most listeners did not understand when they heard it, and many did not understand for years afterward. John Henry Bonham's bass drum pattern, in the verses of Good Times, Bad Times, is a triplet figure, played with a single foot at a speed that most trained drummers in 1968 would not have been able to achieve with a double bass pedal. He was playing what is, by the standards of rock drumming in 1968, an almost impossible figure, and he was playing it with 1 foot, consistently, at performance tempo, and making it look completely natural. Musicians who were listening carefully when the album was released assumed that Bonham was using a double bass drum setup. He was not. He never used one. The triplet figure on Good Times, Bad Times was a product of a physical technique that he had developed independently and that no other drummer of his generation possessed in the same form. 9 days after the first session, on October 3rd, the album was finished, mixed, sequenced, and ready to be cut to a master disc. The studio bill came to £1,780. Page paid it. The $1,782 was not what Page and Grant spent. It was what the studio charged for the time. The strategic cost of making the album the way they made it was considerably larger, because it meant that when they walked into record label offices in November 1968, they were not asking for help. They were offering a product. The distinction between those two positions was everything. Peter Grant had spent months cultivating a relationship with Ahmet Ertegun, the founder and president of Atlantic Records, who had signed Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin and John Coltrane, and who had built Atlantic into the most musically credible major label in America. Ertegun had heard about Led Zeppelin through the network of musicians and industry figures, who had been talking about the band since before they had a record deal. By the time Grant formally approached Atlantic with the finished album in his hands, Ertegun had been primed to hear it by the accumulated enthusiasm of people whose judgment he trusted. On November 11, 1968, Jimmy Page, Peter Grant, and attorney Stephen Weiss sat down with Ahmet Ertegun and signed an agreement with Atlantic Records. The advance was $104,000, worth approximately $900,000 in 2025 terms. It was, at the time, the largest advance ever paid to a new act by any major label. But the money, substantial as it was not the most important thing. Page and Grant extracted from the negotiation. The most important thing was control. The contract gave Led Zeppelin full approval over every aspect of their recordings, including which songs to record, how to arrange and produce them, the sequencing of albums, the artwork, and the release schedule. Atlantic could not instruct them to change a song, remove a track, alter an arrangement, or release anything on a timeline that the band had not approved. This level of creative control was so far outside the standard record contract of 1968 that it required the Atlantic legal team to draft entirely new language to accommodate it. Ahmet Ertegun agreed to these terms because he understood that the people sitting across from him were not asking for his permission to make their music. They had already made it. They were deciding whether to let Atlantic distribute it. Beyond the Atlantic deal, Page and Grant had structured the broader business of Led Zeppelin in a way that reflected the same principle applied to every dimension of the enterprise. They had formed a company called Super Hype Music to handle publishing, which meant that the band retained ownership of their compositions rather than signing them to a publisher who would then collect a percentage of every royalty forever. They negotiated directly with concert promoters rather than through booking agents, which in practice meant Peter Grant sitting across a table from a promoter and demanding 90% of the box office gross, a figure so far beyond what any band had previously demanded that most promoters laughed until they understood Grant was not joking. The 90-10 split became standard across the industry within a decade. Every major touring act that has played an arena or stadium since the 1980s has negotiated from a baseline that Peter Grant established by demanding it first. The first Led Zeppelin album was released in the United States on January 12, 1969. It reached number 10 on the Billboard 200. In the United Kingdom, where it was released on March 31st, it reached number 6. It received 8 times platinum certification from the Recording Industry Association of America, a diamond certification in Canada, and has sold in cumulative numbers that make it one of the best-selling debut albums by any artist in the history of recorded music. The 782 that Jimmy Page spent at Olympic Studios in September and October of 1968 returned, by the most conservative estimate, several £100 million across the lifetime of Led Zeppelin's recording career. The Atlantic advance alone returned 60 times the recording cost within months of signing. The revenue from touring, from publishing, from the master recordings that Page and Grant retained ownership of, from the catalog licensing that has generated income every year since the band dissolved in 1980, represents a return on that original investment that has no meaningful precedent in the music industry. But the real cost was not the money. The real cost was the risk taken by a 24-year-old guitarist who had given up a secure and well-paid career as a session musician to form a band with 3 people he had met weeks earlier who had then spent his own money to record an album with no guarantee that any label would want it, and who had structured every dimension of the business around the conviction that his musical judgment was correct, and that no one who was not in the room when the music was made was in a position to improve on it. That conviction was the real investment. The 1,782 was just the invoice. Jimmy Page has been asked many times over the decades about the first album and why it came together so quickly. His answers have been consistent across all the years and all the interviews. He knew what he wanted. He had been thinking about it for years, before he had a band capable of executing it. The band he assembled in August 1968 was specifically chosen because each member was capable of doing what he needed them to do without guidance or correction. Rehearsal had fixed the arrangements. The Scandinavian tour had fixed the performances. Olympic Studios had the technical capability to capture what the band was doing. All that remained was to do it. He told Brad Tolinski in a published conversation, "I financed and completely recorded the first album before going to Atlantic. I wanted artistic control in a vice grip because I knew exactly what I wanted to do with the band. And then, we recorded the whole first album in a matter of 30 hours. The other advantage of having such a clear vision was that it kept recording costs to a minimum. In 30 hours, at a cost of £1,782, with a band that had existed for 36 days, Jimmy Page made the record he had been planning to make for years. The speed was not the product of carelessness or limitation. It was the product of complete preparation and complete clarity. There was nothing to decide in the studio, because everything had already been decided. The only question remaining was whether what Page had heard in his head would translate to tape the way he intended. It did, and it cost him £1,782 to find out. If this story surprised you, there's more where this came from. Every episode on this channel is a real, documented Led Zeppelin story that history buried. Subscribe and hit the bell. New episode every week.